And we are live. Hello, and welcome everybody to Reedsy Live. My name is Martin. I'm from the team here at Reedsy. We're a marketplace that connects authors and writers with professionals who can help you write and publish a better book. This is Reedsy Live. It's a very special edition, for we have a very special guest joining us today to talk about so many things. She's a best-selling author. She is someone who spans genres and has put out more books than some people have read, and we're really, really pleased to have her with us today. While we wait, everyone just say hello. Tell us where you're coming from today. I see already lots of folks from the States. We have Ivana from Argentina, John from Mission Viejo, California, John from Erie, Pennsylvania. Fantastic. So many folks here. If you sort of enjoy this content, do remember to give it a like. That'll help this get seen by folks out there who might be browsing YouTube and wondering what to watch at this moment. But it's a very special one. I'm not going to be doing this alone. I'm actually joined with a very special co-host in the form of Rebecca Heyman. Hey, Rebecca, how are you doing?
I am doing so well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Regular viewers may notice that this is a new background. I've just moved house, moved cities, so still setting things up. All my posters are just yet to be hung. But yeah, regular viewers who know Becca as the host and creator of First Line Frenzy. But you are
And
here
my
today.
snow fence.
And your snow fence.
My background has never changed.
But to be fair,
forever,
I think
forever the snow fence.
you're using a better camera now, so we can see that it's definitely not snow and almost certainly white fences.
I mean, it's October, so soon it might be snow. You never know in New England. Last year we had nothing, and this year we may be buried under feet and feet of the white stuff for months.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining. Becca has been an editor here at Reedsy for ages, and you are much more sort of familiar with this space than I am. What can you sort of tell me about the sort of space that our guest today works in, the sort of romanticy space, without sort of spoiling too much?
Yeah, so I mean, romantasy is one of like the fastest growing genres that we're seeing right now in contemporary fiction. It is, of course, a blend of fantasy with a strong romance through line in terms of plot and characterization. We're going to be talking more about that with our guest a little later in the hour. So it's just a really exciting space to be working in right now. And of course, a huge part of romantasy is the fandoms that sort of spring up around these various series and brands. And so I'm sure that a lot of our viewers today are really excited to see sort of the person behind, one of these massive successes in the romantasy space.
Cool. That's a hell of a tease if ever there was one. All right. I've got a little intro sequence. So the real show hasn't started. It starts in 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to Reedsy Live. My name is Martin. I'm part of the team here at Reedsy. This is Reedsy Live, the ongoing series of webinars where we bring on professionals from the world of publishing to show you how to write and publish better books. Today I'm joined by my co-host Rebecca Heyman. Rebecca, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I really appreciate you joining us today. Regular viewers will know you as the host and creator of First Line Frenzy, but today you are here as an interviewer. Have you ever interviewed anyone before on a public forum?
I have. I've interviewed a lot of people and I've moderated a lot of at conferences and stuff. So I feel like this is one of my other faces.
Fantastic. So you are available for bookings?
They all have to go through my Martin management, I think.
I'm taking a very reasonable 45%, so don't you worry. Cool. Well, everyone, I think, is here for one reason. There's a lot of stuff to get through. If you'd like to introduce our guest, I'll be in the background. If you sort of just set things up, if anyone needs anything, I'll be manning the sort of chat there on YouTube, and there'll be a Q&A at the end. So, yeah.
Reiterate Martin's welcome to Reedsy Live. Today I have the great honor and pleasure of interviewing Jennifer L. Armentrout, author of New York Times best-selling, international best-selling, USA Today best-selling books. She has over 70 books in publication. And of course, you are probably familiar with some of her romantasy work, such as the Blood and Ash series. So there's so much we can learn from Jennifer. She's both self-published and trad so she's a true hybrid author, sort of living into this contemporary model of authorship, and she's doing amazing work. So we're really excited to have her here, and I guess we're going to get started. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me.
I feel very comfortable speaking on behalf of the entire Reedsy community when I say that we're honored to have you here and we're so excited. Um, so I always like to start interviews with bookish folk by asking what you're reading right now.
Well, right now I am on a super deadline that I am actually very behind on. So I haven't read anything probably in the last like couple weeks, but I am getting ready to read an ARC, an advanced
Mm,
copy. And if you bear with me, it's called Realm of Thieves by
mm.
Karina Hall. So I'm getting ready to hopefully start reading that soon. But like when I'm on like super deadline, it's hard for me to like read for enjoyment because then I'm just like comparing myself to whatever I'm reading. So but yeah, so that's what I'm getting ready to read.
I love that. I very recently made the difficult decision to close my NetGalley account for good. I got so behind on my arcs because there's just so much great stuff to read that I realized I was being like a bad arc ally. And I was like, I have to take the pressure off because I always felt like I should be reading, all these books before they publish. So I've released that from my plate and it's actually felt pretty good. Though I have terrible FOMO now. I feel like I'm missing out on a lot of great things. Um, so you're on deadline. Does this have anything to do with the title you recently shared on your Instagram? I believe it's The Primal of Blood and Bone. Is that right?
Yes, yes. I am currently writing that book. And I feel like anytime that you get several books into a series, at least for me, it takes longer for me to write those books because you have all the books that came previous to that even as the author you struggle to remember sometimes like fine details. And since it's the last book featuring the main couple, you there's so much stuff going through your head as you're writing that you're wanting to make sure that you're giving the readers like every possible thing they could want. So it's been taking a while for me to write that, but yeah, it's I feel like I've been on deadline for like years at this point, but I'm coming down to the crunch where I've got to get it done.
Yeah, that's really challenging. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is, when you develop a series that has such a rightfully and very well warranted rabid fandom like the Blood and Ash series, how do you balance this sort of um, the weight of reader expectations with your own creative spark? Like, how much does that play into how you write and your process of developing the story? Since in the age of book talk, in the age of bookstagram, people are not shy about their projections, their predictions, and their hot takes.
I think I feel like there's always at least for me, there's always a part of you that kind of wants to know what readers expect. Um, Even though that's probably not going to end well for you, like in terms of creativity, especially if what they're expecting or their theories is actually not going to happen. But even worse in a way is when they're like completely on point guessing like what. And then there's a part of you that's like, yes, they're getting it, but then you're like, oh damn, was it too obvious? So I mean, it's you go back and forth. And one thing I've had to learn is I have to recognize, like, when I'm letting too many outside voices start to get into my head, and then I do need to step back, because even the good stuff can have such an impact on what you're writing. Because again, if people, like, for example, if they really love the banter that is in a between two characters, but you know that maybe this book is not going to have that, or people really love a character, but you know you're getting ready to kill that character. And so, like, you have to know when to step back. And I feel like even before book talk, there was always that knowledge that at any time people are going to give you feedback whether you asked for it or not. And I remember back when, like, Twitter was really heavily used, just for, like, communication and book stuff. Like, it sometimes would feel a little bit like a landmine, like you did not know, like, when you opened up a tweet, like, was it going to be just a normal thing, or was it going to be something you probably didn't want to see that day? So I've had to learn, like, when I know it's starting to get to me, that I have to step back. But I've always believed, like, places like Book Talk are meant for readers. And I think it gets very complicated when authors start to encroach upon that space, because I think it starts to facilitate those types of situations more. But also, more importantly, I know a lot of readers, they probably aren't comfortable with authors, like, watching their stuff, right? Like, they may feel like, oh, I can't be honest because that author may come in. And I know that you've been doing this for a while. There was a time where it was like every week you would have, an author doing something that you would be like, do you not have any friends, anybody in your life that could have been like, don't do that? What are you
Hey,
doing?
that's a bad idea. Yeah, like put it
Like,
down. It's
maybe
time
not.
to stop interneting for the day. Yeah.
Get off the
Um,
internet.
it it's really interesting that you mentioned that these are reader spaces. I'm going to take a moment to remind our audience that tagging authors in negative reviews reserves you a special place in hell. So we don't do that. That's not something we do, because you're right. I mean, these spaces are about fandom,
Mhm.
community, being a literary citizen of the world. To be that literary citizen, you used to have to walk into a bookstore and attend readings. And now we've brought that incredible community right into people's homes. And of course, we have to hope that people don't abuse the privilege. It's
But
so
also,
interesting to,
well, and also just to add, like, I'm not sure what people expect when they do that, because the book is written, it's published, it's not going
it's
to do.
out, man. Yeah.
And we all have to remember, what somebody loves, another person hates, and what someone hates, another person loves. And as a writer, you cannot cater to that. You have to write
Mm-mm.
what you want to write, because you're never going to make everybody happy. And I do think that is something that takes some time to learn. Like, you think you know that. I'm going to tell you, you probably don't until you like a couple of books underneath your belt, because
Yeah.
it'll get to you at some point, and you kind of have to
Yeah.
learn that. But yeah.
So when we think about reader response to our work, um, a lot of our viewers today are at the beginning of their author journey, and they have other jobs, other gigs, they're non-professional, they're getting ready to put their work out into the world. But we know that self-publishing is not an easier path than tradpub. It requires an incredible amount of work in a lot of different realms, and one of the ways to ease some of that labor is to assemble a really great team. So when you were starting out, I'm interested in what your team priorities were. Like, when it was Avengers Assemble time, who did you want at your back first, in terms of editing, design, art, PR, things like that? Like, who should our newer authors be focused on getting on into their stable the fastest?
Well, when I started out, you didn't have really an Avengers team to assemble. And it wasn't really that long ago. I mean, it's going
Yeah.
on, or is 15 years. My God, it has been 15 years. Um,
Whoa.
yeah, I'm like, I don't want to think about that.
Yeah, let's
Um,
not.
but also 15 years is not a long time in reality. However, publishing has changed so drastically in those 15 years. When I first started, like back in 2009, 2010, um, self-publishing was not seen as a viable option. And neither was small press publishing. It
Hmm.
was heavily frowned upon. And if you wrote in a genre like young adult, which is how I started, you had to have, in a way, traditional publishing because you had to have your books into the bookstores and into libraries because teenagers weren't buying books online. And you were kind of limited, or you thought you were. But the interesting thing is about the 2011 to 2012 period is it was almost like this explosion of
The boom.
self-publishing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And small press publishers at the same time, because publishing was, I feel like, was going through this same revamp that we don't have to have these massive offices in New York City and, have a million authors that we can't pay attention to all of them. So the way I got started was a little bit different. But one of the things that I think is super important is an editor first and foremost. And
Wow, what an
because
incredible answer.
yes.
So say as the editor. I swear I did not coach or pay Jennifer to give that response. Go on, please.
No, but it's true because here's the thing. The editorial process isn't, and when I say it's not fun, what I mean by it's not as fun as getting cover comps, right? It's not as fun as talking about PR and marketing plans. And trust me, that will stop being fun, the marketing PR plans. But it is the most important part of a book. And my first book, when it was published, it was with a small press. And at that time, small presses, and still to this day, they run just like traditional publishers, where they have an editorial department. It's just much smaller, much more condensed. And the way I approached when I indie published, I approached it like if I was the publisher, right? As if we're self-publishing, we are the publisher. And that means that you have to, or you should, go through the same steps that a publisher would. And an editorial is the most important because there's something that your brain does that we don't realize often, is that your brain will autocorrect things as you're reading it, right? Because you probably think, oh, I know how to edit. I'm good at editing. The problem is when you're often reading your own stuff, you know what you meant to write. You meant to say shirt, but instead it says shit, and you just don't catch that because your brain is putting that R in there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that
You're
makes
work blind.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I mean,
And you've probably read it, right? You've developed that. You've
mhm,
had that sentence in your head for so long that you
mhm,
stop seeing the truth of it. And at the line level, I mean, absolutely. There's nothing like fresh eyes at the line level. Do
exactly.
you find, I mean, do you have at this point in your career, um, like a creative sounding board or an editor that you're using more on the developmental side to talk through, especially now that the worlds you've created have become so enormous? I mean, do you have a safe sounding board for a lot of those fresh ideas?
Well, like other than my friends that I use, which I'm sure some of them are excited about that, and then others are like, please shut up. But the good thing is, there are different types of editors, right? There are some editors who are really good at editing. They're good at line edits. They're good at breaking down sentence structure and maybe not so great at story development. And I've been very lucky that when I've written long series, that the editorial team that I've had, the main editor, has been great with helping with story development. Like if
Mm.
you have an idea in your head, like a plot, but something's not working, um, I've had at least three editors from everybody I worked with that would get on the phone for 3 hours and hash it out. And that's not,
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty rare, like, especially in the publishing house side.
Yeah.
But when it's like a traditional publish, I mean, when it's self-published, I mean, it's like, some of my friends that I've met through, the industry, like going to signings and stuff, like back in the day, the big thing was blogging. And I had, you would keep seeing the same bloggers at all the events. And I've become really good friends with quite a bit of them. And, they would be who I would go to if I didn't have an editorial team to kind of fall back on.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful. I work in a lot of developmental editing, and I find that authors get very anxious about, pulling back the curtain and revealing their work to someone for the first time and in a critical capacity, right? Like, we're here to dissect this thing and shine a light in all the shadowy corners and interrogate all the things you thought no one would notice, right? And so, um, to have that kind of relationship over a long time too with this community you've built must be amazing. Um, I think I think there's something to be said about um, having these long-term relationships with people that you used to see at signings and meeting them in person, when so much of book publishing can feel like it's behind a screen these days. So that in-person component is so nice. I also am curious. So you mentioned that you published for the first time in 2009, which is, of course, 2 years after the Kindle came to market, and
Well,
that Kindle.
started, I started to query to publish in 2009, but my first book didn't come out until 2011 or 2010.
And was
So
that, did you self-publish first or did you trad pub first?
it was small press publisher. It was
You did
small
small
press.
press.
So
Yep.
it was pretty much considered self-publishing at that time.
Yeah.
People did
It's
not
amazing
distinguish.
how the stigma has
Oh yeah.
dissolved in a lot of ways, or changed or morphed into something else now, because there is so much access to publishing professionals and to these barriers, sort of barriers to entry, that simulate a trad pub process. But of course, some of our viewers may be familiar with that sort of golden era of self pub, which was 2011, 2012, when we saw the first Kindle millionaires, the first people to start earning
Mhm.
these huge salaries, six figures and higher, on Kindle. And since then, I think because the market has been saturated in different ways, and because publishing is morphing all the time, that is less common, certainly. But we see hybrid authors like yourself moving into that space of greater access, greater reach, the ability to make quick decisions on your feet about your content, but also having the support of that trad pub machine behind you. So what do you think is, I'm going to say, the best part of each side of hybrid, right? Like, what is the best part of self pub and what's the best part of trad?
Well, I think that, like, okay, so ugh. So, like, the best
You're like,
part,
it's all terrible.
no, no, I sometimes can, be a little bit too honest about certain things. But no, so, the best part about self-publishing, I would say, um, is the same as one of the worst parts, and that is you have complete control. And while some people might be like, that doesn't make any sense, but it does in a way, because sometimes you may think you know what you're doing, and you do, but there are people who may know more or know better or can step in and say, hey, I know you're thinking about publishing a book in December, but you probably shouldn't do that. Like, that kind of thing. And so, but the good side of that is that you do have control. You're not being gate kept from something. You're not having to worry about, you know, a contract that where let's say they bought three contemporary romances from you, but they decide, which is what this happened around, I think, 2015, 2016, the traditional publishing world kind of like conceded defeat to self-publishing when it came to romance, like contemporary
Mm,
romance, because they could not, for whatever reason, figure out how to compete with digital pricing. They just couldn't do it. Like, and so they
mm,
started like letting go of their what they call their mid-list authors. And to be mid-list, that doesn't mean you're mid. That means that your books almost always bring in a certain amount of money that the publisher can count on. Mid-list is often what keeps bills at the publishing houses being paid. And they just like, I mean, they cleared house. Like it was insane. And or they would be like, "Oh, why don't you try writing this?" And it would be a genre that you're like, "I have no interest in writing that. Like, what are you talking about?" And so when you're self-publishing, you're not really having to worry with that stuff. And also, like, you don't have to worry so much about writing something that is trendy at that point, right? Which of course, publishers at the end of the day, they're there to make money. And so they're going to want books that they think are going to sell. And when you are self publishing, you can either write that book that is trendy, or you can write the story that really isn't being written right now. You have that option. And with traditional publishing, obviously, like some of the good stuff that you have is distribution, right? Into libraries, especially, and into the indie bookstores, the independent bookstores. And it's very difficult, even as a traditionally published author, to get into indie bookstores because obviously their space is much smaller. Distribution is the biggest thing with traditional publishing. Also, their editorial teams. Like, and that's not to say that there is never going to be a typo in that book. I'm here to tell you every single book known to mankind has a typo in
everyone
it.
has a typo. Yes.
Yeah, like it just does. And that's just a fact of life. But you do have these big editorial teams. You have your main editor. You then have a separate copy editor. You have a separate copy editor / line editor. They have entire proofing teams that you're not paying for. Like you don't have to come up with the money for that. Um,
Yeah.
so, on the flip side, though, with distribution, one of the biggest hindrances for the longest time for self publishing and even small press publishers was a strong presence in stores like Barnes and Noble. And you could go back probably a couple years and you would have never in a million years seen a table, because table placement in a Barnes and Noble used to cost an arm and a leg for a publisher to get. And
Hmm.
but now you walk in there, what do you see? Book talk recommendations. And that table will often be full of self-published books. And one of the biggest things that happened was Waterstones, I believe it was Waterstones, had bought out Barnes and Noble, or they merged, and they ended up changing the way that Barnes and Noble acquires books. It used to be on a
Mm.
larger regional level. So somebody sitting somewhere made the decisions on what books would be carried in that store. The people in those stores didn't really have a choice. And they changed that and basically like everybody can order what they want. And that
Wow.
blew the doors off more than
Yeah.
I think. And again, a lot of people wouldn't realize that unless you knew the workings of these things. And as not to say that book talk wasn't a huge influence, but so was that, because that leveled the playing field uh, to such an unbelievable level. I mean, and it also allowed small press books, right, to get the same type of a presence into these bookstores. Because if you look at some of the big successful books that have come out, they've been from small press publishers, Fourth Wing,
Oh,
for
yeah.
example.
Yep.
Um, so I mean, it's and one of the things that also helped with that, obviously, was the fact that they could get that massive distribution into Barnes and Noble and into these bigger brick and mortar stores. And that, I think, kind of almost a little bit knocks out a bit of the positive from traditional publishing.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize that Barnes and Noble had become that's more of an independent bookstore model, right? Where the people in the store are deciding what's on the shelves.
Mhm.
And some of our viewers might not know that publishers used to basically pay for shelf space and like
And
end
it's
cap
an
space.
insane
And
amount of money.
right. And that all came at an incredible premium because,
Mhm.
I mean, publishers understand um, like how people shop for books as much as they
Mhm.
understand books themselves. And so you were being shown books, and then you were like, oh, I'm going to buy this. I've heard so many people talk about it, not realizing that people are talking about it because it's what they've been shown in the store. So that's really amazing. I love that that individual stores have the opportunity to like feel more independent and maybe
And to
satisfy
service their
their local
readers.
communities more.
Yeah, they're able to service their readers' needs. I mean, one of the things that it benefited traditional publishing at that time is it did allow them to steer and determine the market, to determine what people are reading, right? For the longest time, publishers were able to make a bestseller and they
Mm-hmm.
could steer that market. And because they had the money to go in there, because some of that space would also have, you would have to bid for that space, because especially like the tower spaces, like those towers that come in that are like decorated to match the book, like that is, like you said, at a premium, and you would have publishers bidding on that, especially as you get closer to Christmas when you have all the box
Mm-hmm.
sets and things like that. And it just blew the doors off. I mean,
Yeah.
it's when you really think about that change that it did. It was great for authors, and I do think also extremely great for readers, because they would go into, they would hear about this book being talked about online, right? And then they would go to their bookstores, and they would be like, we don't have that. They could order it,
Yeah.
but now they go in there and it's sitting in there.
It's there. Yeah, it's there. I want to go back to something you said about typos. Martin, our fearless moderator, and I both crochet, and there's this sort of like legend that yarn crafters know, which is that you put your heart and soul into your work. And so the errors, which are inevitable, are where your soul gets out so that you don't get
Mhm.
trapped in your own work. And I like to tell my authors that their past final edit typos and mistakes are just where the soul gets out so that they can move on and write something else. So don't stress, everyone, don't stress over the typos. We all forgive you. I want to pivot a little bit and talk to you about romantasy as a genre. um, there was a Guardian article in February 2024 that said um, romantasy as a term was first seen in the Urban Dictionary in 2008, but this term was not popularized until 2022 when Bloomsbury claims they invented the word to describe the work of Sarah J. Maas. Now, whether they invented the word or not, certainly it has become codified as the merging of fantasy and romance. But what I want to know is, do you see romantasy as having specific tropes or developing specific tropes to differentiate it from paranormal romance, to differentiate it from, you know,
All the
genre
fantasy of
romance?
romance that has existed
Yes,
already.
exactly. So, like, right now, romantasy is just, well, it has elements of fantasy and it has elements of romance. So, we're going to make this portmanteau and we're going to call it romantasy. But as you've worked in this genre and sort of seen it develop from the ground up, do you feel like it is developing its own set of tropes?
Um, so I remember when A Court of Thorn and Roses came out, and I will say this, Bloomsbury did use those words on the marketing, because I remember like a lot of us like being like, how do you pronounce that? That doesn't mean that they created that word. I have no idea
Yeah,
about that. But they didn't create the genre, because the genre has always been here. It's called
yeah.
romance with fantasy elements,
Hmm.
or
Yeah,
the fantasy genre with romance subgenre, or vice versa.
yeah,
It has always been,
exactly.
yeah. So, but here's the thing though. Here is what's different about it is beforehand it was often shelved in paranormal in the romance uh area with paranormal. And I think the reason being is because you did not see a lot of what they call high fantasy that had strong romantic elements in it. And I think if you can name some well-known fantasy series, you will easily be able to say they often do not have romance. Um, if they do have romance, it's usually does not end well for that couple. And it was very male oriented in a way. The majority
And of
of it.
course, this was from an authorship perspective. This high fantasy has been dominated by men
Mhm.
for a long time. Tolkien, George Martin, even Patrick Rothfuss. Like, we, whether we're going way back or more recent, that
Mhm.
has traditionally been a male dominated space, and of course, romantasy is changing that, I think, for the good. But go on. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're 100% right. And it's the fantasy books that existed that were romances, again, they weren't given enough airtime, right? They were often put in with another genre, and romance has struggled to earn respect since the creation of the romance genre. Even though romance is the highest performing industry in publishing, and it has
Yes.
been since I started publishing.
Forever. Yes.
Yeah. So,
Romance has been the number one selling genre in publishing since publishing. I remind people of this stat all the time. Women readers and women writers have been driving publishing forward in the modern age
mhm.
for the duration of that time. And it's about time that fantasy catches up, frankly.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like fantasy was one of the last, and it's not the last genre. There's still other genres out there that, you don't see it as prevalent. But with fantasy, it's taken a while to get the respect of being a fantasy book that is also a romance. And I think that is why the new genre term was kind of created, because there was this period of, you know what? Yeah, it's a fantasy romance. It's a fantasy book with romance. And it seemed like for the longest time, you just were not called fantasy. You were called paranormal. And if you go back and look at the 2000s and the 2010s, you will see fantasy romance books that I call them, because they used to call them urban fantasy back in the
Urban
day. And
fantasy. Yes.
they don't call it that anymore. I do not know what they call it. So I just call it contemporary fantasy, meaning it takes
Mm,
place in our actual world, or
yes.
some form of our world. And you always saw that back then. But one of the things that I think that helped make, obviously, fantasy romance take off, other than romance finally, like, and again, I feel like Book Talk is owed a lot of
A
the
lot of
thanks,
credit.
because they were not ashamed to sit there and talk about the different, the romance books that they like. But fantasy, I think about, it has such crossover appeal. And by that, I mean it's skipping ages, it's skipping genders, because while somebody may be reading it for romance, another person's reading it for the action, the fantasy element of it. And that is something that I think is newer, and why fantasy romance does have a little bit of its own tropes, is the fantasy element of it, and the plot, and everything that deals with the fantasy side has as much prevalence as the romance does. And that's not something you always see in other genres. Usually it's a romance with a
It's one or
suspense.
the other with like a
Yeah.
little flavor. Yeah.
And so it's that crosses people's typical reading habits.
Yeah.
And also, it has opened up the doors to readers who never thought that they would like reading romance. They pick up a book, because one thing you'll notice about a lot of fantasy romance, and I don't know if you can see some of the covers behind me or not, but they don't look like romances. They
Yes.
look like fantasy books. So
Yes.
they may not be aware that they're reading a fantasy romance, and it's expanding the readership, which
We'll get
It's,
everyone on team romance eventually. We'll
yeah.
snag them all. We'll do it by hook or by crook. You know,
Mhm.
I just devoured T.J. Klune's Green Creek series, which if you like gay werewolves, have I got some great news for you. Um, and what's so interesting is in preparing to talk to you, I was thinking like, what romantasy have I read most recently? And there is an incredibly strong romance through line, a fated mates through line in each of the four books in that series. And of course, it has to do with werewolves and witches. But I
Mhm.
wouldn't call it romantasy. I would have called it PNR. I would have still put it in paranormal. And I think it's because, as you say, this old term urban romance, which if people don't know, there was, urban
Yeah.
fantasy was the opposite of high fantasy. It was a way of saying urban had nothing to do with cities, which is why it was always a trash term because people didn't understand that. Urban just meant having to do with the urbane.
Yeah.
It was about fantasy that took place in our world, and so there is still a part of me that looks at a series like that and goes, "Oh no, that's not romantasy."
Yeah. I
Even
call
though
it
I think
paranormal.
romantasy
Yeah.
readers would love that. I mean, so there is something. There's sort of there's still like this tonal or textural difference, I think, between romantasy and PNR. And I'm happy that I think they feed each other.
Well, yeah, and
But
I can tell you right now, a lot of fantasy romance readers don't read paranormal romance. And the reason why I know this is because when I would have readers who first read me with the fantasy series, they don't realize that I have like a kabillion books that are paranormal romance. So they like the books happily, and then they start going back and reading my backlist.
yeah,
And then they're like, "Oh," like, and then from there, I can see them in my reader group, them talking about picking up this series and that series. And again, it goes back to how romance has always had to fight for its place
respect.
and everything, and paranormal romance even more so because it's just I don't even understand where the attitude comes from because it's like people like watching movies about vampires and werewolves and witches and all this other stuff, but for some reason you put it in a book and you add a love story, then it's like can't be reading that.
I I have a theory. And my theory is that it has always been a little too easy for women and other minority identities to coalesce around romance. And I think the old guys, I think it freaks them out. I think it scares them when
Well,
we all get excited
yeah,
about something
I've always
together and we
I've
become
always
very
said
powerful.
yeah, I've always said
Yeah.
that one of the reasons why romance is always so targeted, because you know what, it hasn't happened in a while. Mark my words, it's going to be out in a couple weeks where some idiot, and I'm going to say idiot, who has not picked up a romance clearly since 1980 because they're talking about like Fabio covers for some reason.
I know.
Will do this op-ed that this major media platform said, "Yeah, we'll publish that." Like,
Hmm.
and you'll feel like, "What?" And the thing is, it's not just guys that do that.
No,
Some of the most scathing and ill-informed takedowns of romance is by
have
women.
come from
They
women. Yeah.
clearly not read a diverse selection remotely.
No.
I
And
think it's
like
because
wholly internalized misogyny, Batman.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
we can't,
Yeah.
you published what should have been in your diary and now we've all seen behind the curtain. But it's like this idea that centering desire
Mhm.
is somehow less than centering war or politics
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
some kind of violence, right? That
Well, and
somehow centering love is less valuable.
yeah, and so for me, having started my writing journey and career in young adult, one of my biggest soapboxes was how it was you oh my god, you the editorial notes, the roadblocks that you would hit by having romance in your books, and if there was any sort of sexual activity, no matter how not on the page it is or on the page that it is, but you don't get a single note about extremely detailed, horrific violence in your book.
Thank
Never
you.
any. about
Graphic
it.
violence they're fine with, like these play-by-play scenes where you're watching someone be eviscerated, and then but like a little, oh, there's Prim in the
Kitty.
back,
I
sorry.
was like,
There she is, everyone. But then you take someone's clothes off and like heaven forfend,
yeah, it's like,
um
yeah.
I I'm so glad that you have all the correct opinions on this matter. I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up to the Q&A, and that is, you've done so many interviews over the course of your career. I listened to some podcasts that you have recorded previously. Is there a question that you never get asked that you wish you would get asked?
Um, oh God. I don't know. I feel like I've been asked so many questions. I can tell you what I think is the most difficult question to ask, and I inwardly cringe every time it's asked
Oh
because
yes, tell us what it is.
and the main reason is because the answer is never, I feel like, what people expect. It's a combination of two. What is your motivation for writing and where do you get your ideas? Every time I'm asked that, I'm like, because I can't really tell you. Things just pop in my head. But
Yeah.
also, I write because I'm easily bored. I have ADHD. I have to entertain myself. So I feel like it's always like people are waiting to hear like this motivational answer. And I'm over here
And the
like,
secret, yeah,
yeah,
they want the
no,
secret, but the
I'm
secret
bored.
is it's time and hard
Yeah,
work and just letting your brain be
yeah,
neurospicy and see what happens.
right.
So Martin, our moderator, has been collecting questions from our viewers while we've been chatting. And so, Martin, did you want to throw the first question up on the screen for us here?
Yeah, we've been sort of collecting quite a lot of people, but here's a question from Lena. Beck, if you want to read it.
Okay. Yeah, I do. Let me just move this screen up a little bit so I can see. It says, Jennifer, can you speak more about how you write early in the morning, every day? Do you write into the laptop or by hand? Is there much discipline doing your work? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Um, Yeah, I right now and have for a very long time I have to write every day practically. And that's because of deadlines. And that's also because there's a period of time where I feel like when you're a new author and especially like when you are getting like publishing contracts, you're like, they like me. I can't say no. And because they're
Mm,
going to stop liking me eventually. And so you find yourself way over committed. And there's really nothing you can do about that. So I pretty much do write every day. I have gotten a bit easier on myself. Like when I wake up and I'm just like, I don't want to do this, I allow myself to not do it. But I usually have to start writing by 11 o'clock. If I do not start writing by 11, I'm going to lose the entire day. I don't,
mm.
that's just something with me. Um, and more preferably, I want to start writing around like 9, 10. And so I would try to get everything else done before then, you know, answering emails, that kind of stuff. But I used to write, oh my God, like until 7 or 8 o'clock at night, sometimes longer. So it would be well over 12-hour days. Yeah, I don't do that anymore.
Yeah, no.
I
The
can't.
burnout is real. Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't. I think I always caution my creatives. I feel like I have to mother hen them sometimes because they're on a roll and they have a word count goal, which I think is not very functional. And and then there's that desire to just be busy instead of
Well,
being
I think it's
productive.
not just that. It is the pressure of releasing books quick because that's
Yeah.
one thing you see with self-publishing, and especially in any genre with romance. These books will come out like this,
Yeah, six a
nonstop.
year. I mean, I have authors
I
who are doing
used to
six a
write
year.
8
I
books
don't,
a year,
it's amazing.
and
That's
I would have
wild.
8 books a year, and I would have 8 books come out, and there was a time that they were all with different publishers because I worked with
Wow.
many publishers, and I burnt myself out. Like I literally, I feel like I broke myself. Like, because I look back and I'm like, I don't know how I did that. That's just not going to happen now. And that could be a question I wish people would ask is, do you think it's good to write like that? And I say, look, if you can do it, you're going to do it at the end of the day. But I don't think you should, because
Yeah.
it's extremely hard to maintain. And then you basically are, I don't know what the word is, but like you're grooming your readers to expect these books to come out so quickly, and there's going to
Yeah.
come a time you're not going to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And you then have that added pressure of disappointing your readers added onto it. So I would strongly advise, caution authors, as someone who did it for years, it's going to take its toll on you.
Yeah. I
So
think also like the sorry, Martin, the writers I work with who do try to produce at that extremely high level sometimes get frustrated that they can't tell the stories that they really want to write, and because they haven't given themselves time to sit with the work and let it settle and edit and develop and sort of go back and tinker, because you're right, the pressure to publish is so heavy that they
Mhm.
can't get out of their own way. And so I think it really squashes like the, I don't know what you call creative libido, but like it really harshes the vibe, right? Like you really can't be creative at that high level all the time over
No.
time. Yeah.
And to kind of like answer like more so that question, I realize I really didn't answer it, but I do have a kind of a schedule I follow. Like I used to write until I finished a chapter or hit a certain word count, and I've learned that I just had to kind of get away from that, because sometimes you're not going to hit that word count, but you wrote some damn good words. And then you would leave the day still feeling disappointed because you didn't hit your word count. So I've learned for myself that I have to get away from that. But guess what? For you, you may need that word count. You may need that as a guideline. But I do think it's good if you can only write a couple hours a day or an hour a day, that you stick to it, and set that rhythm of doing it, because that's how you get a book finished, is
Yeah.
by putting your ass in the chair at the end of the day. And no, I
Our
don't
next question.
with the computer. I try to do that, and it's just terrible.
Our next question is from Debbie, and she writes, "What was your journey from indie to traditional publishing?" I think we've
Um,
covered some of that, but you
Yeah,
take it
it
away. Yeah.
happened really at the same time, really. While I was submitting so there's this website called querytracker.net or .com that is amazing. It helps you create a query, a synopsis, and keep in mind, if you write a query, that's kind of like your back jacket synopsis of your book. I mean, it does dual purposes there. They also have people there that will like critique your first 10 pages, things like that. And one of the best advice I ever heard there was, when you are on submission with one book, write something completely different. Don't write book
Yes.
two, write something different. And that's kind of what I was doing for like 2 years. I ended up going with a small press publisher first for my first book. And at that time, I was writing another book, and I was submitting to agents. And I got like maybe 150 some rejections before somebody who rejected me on one book actually offered me on another. And that's who's been my agent this whole time. But she sold a traditionally published book at that time for me. And then I went with another small press because I was writing really fast, and traditional publishing cannot keep up
Yeah.
with that. So I was doing them simultaneously. And so so there was really never a journey to it. I was just doing it at the same time.
Amazing. Wow. So
okay,
productive. You're so prolific.
some people here have asked some questions about sort of the nuts and bolts of marketing as a self-published author. Someone asked about do you do your own email and web marketing? Another one asks about the marketing tactics that you find work for you when you're dealing with your self-published books. Can you give maybe just a quick insight into what your sort of day-to-day with the marketing aspect of that looks like?
So when I first started out, I did my own emails, my own all that stuff, right? But also back then, there that you had Blog Tour companies, because that was the big thing, is blog tours. And they didn't cost that much in comparison to a legit PR campaign. So that's what I would do. But here's the thing. I'm going to say probably what no one will say. Whatever I do, it doesn't matter, because I have a backlist. I have a readership. So I can tell you what I do. You can't apply it to someone who's now just starting out, because I'm relying on my readership. But I can tell you what is often done. A lot of it right now is book talk. The problem with that is book talk is organic for the most part. And they are starting to do more advertising into book talk. And there are companies that will go out to book talkers who do offer up services. But right now, book talk is what is organic, seems to be what takes off there. One of the things that I would suggest is getting a mailing list, right? Like, you get yourself a website. I know this sounds like very beginner stage, but these things still matter, right? One of the things I used to do in the beginning, I still do it now, but I did this in the beginning, is you get one of those companies called, like, one we use is like 1-800 a Textler or something, and it allows you to send a text. Like, you get people to agree to sign up for it, and then when you have a new release, it texts them whatever message you want to send, because people, you can't really rely on email all the time. Being active online where you feel comfortable being active is something I would also suggest. So if you like making videos on TikTok, that's a great place for you. But if you're like me and it would just be a complete disaster, people are still on Facebook. I know we like to think that they're not. Nope, they are. And so that may be a place for you. But it's hard to say what works now, because I'm coming from it from a different stage. But also it has changed so much since when I started. Like, as they can tell you, what we used to use for marketing does not exist anymore at all, because it's not a thing anymore.
Our next question is from Natalie, and she asks, should a writer be worried about repetitive tropes or plots, themes that come up a lot in romantasy, such as protagonists avenging little sisters, love triangles, surprise hierarchy, etc.?
Here's the thing, though. Should you be concerned? No. Should you be aware of what the tropes are? Yes. Because here's the thing. Every genre has tropes. Every single one of them. There is nothing unique about any story. The basis of it. The bones of a story. There is nothing. You may think you're the first person to write that. No, you're not. You're not even the 15th person to write that. The difference is how you tell the story. And the difference is your voice as a writer. And one of the things is that you will often see, right? You probably have authors that do write in different genres. You don't even need to see that name on the book sometimes to be like, that sounds like so-and-so, like, because they have a certain voice. And that is what makes those tropes different. Because at the end of the day, there is only so many ways to write a fantasy book. I mean, and I'm going to be honest with you, like, when I was brainstorming, I was like, oh shit. Like, every time I would think of something, I'd be like, I can think of this book that has that. I can think of that book that has that. But then I realized, oh, wait a minute. I'm not telling it that way, though. And so that is the thing you need to focus on, is how are you going to make it different? And when I say make it different, a lot of people then get stuck on, oh, well, it can't follow that tropey guideline. And here's the thing, it may not. But what I'm talking about is, how is your voice going to make it different? Like, what is your style of writing? And you don't even have to know what that is. You probably might not even know what that is. But your version will be different than the other trope. But you're not going to be able to escape the tropes. You're just not going to be able to.
Yeah, the story is in the telling, right? Like, the story is not in the reinvention of the wheel. It's really in how your awareness. I love what you said about being aware of the tropes. Because tropes are also about reader expectation. And so tropes are not bad. Tropes are not bad. Tropes are incredibly powerful in terms of delivering on an experience and establishing a readership. I think if you're if you're sort of anti-trope, or if you're always writing against trope, you're just swimming upstream. I mean, there's no reason to do it.
You only hear tropes mentioned in conversation with romance, as if literary fiction does not have a tropes. As
And
if
they sure do. Yes.
don't have tropes. It's just, it's talked about negatively in romance related genres. It shouldn't be, because they're guidelines to what readers are looking for.
Absolutely.
I have a question here that is perhaps one of my favorite phrased questions. Although it does touch on something that people have been asking a lot about. How should sex be handled? I find it has become a thing.
It's become a thing.
I love that
thing.
I don't know why, but I hear that like in a British accent, and I don't know why this person. I don't know why. I could just hear that. So yeah, it's a thing. But here's the thing: how comfortable are you with writing sex? How comfortable are you with reading it? And if you're not really comfortable with reading it, please God, don't write it, because it's going to be bad. I'm just going to say it.
It's going to be bad.
It's going to be, you're going to end up on like one of those end of the year things where people like the worst written sex scenes. But you don't have sex. Look, here's the thing. My books run the gambit of how much sex in them. There are books that the sex is never really on the page, but people would say that book is very sexual. Then there's books that a ton of sex is on the page. What readers looking for isn't necessarily the actual sex. It's the tension of that relationship. It's the build of that relationship. And where I go with the sex on the page or not, or whatever it is, really is determined by the characters and what makes sense for them. But in reality, the readers, it's not so much the sex often that they're paying attention to. It's everything surrounding the buildup of that relationship.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more, Rebecca. This one, I guess, is sort of a good one to round it off, I suppose.
This one is from June, and it says, "How has your life changed since becoming a best-selling author?"
It really, I don't know. It really hasn't changed, I don't think. I mean, I say that, but then, yeah, I do know it has changed. I think what has changed is I've been able to experience things I never would have had the experiences of like, I remember the first time I received an email from someone who lived in a country that I have never interacted with someone before who lived in that country. And the first time I got an email from someone who, was telling me that my book helped them get through a tough time because they were able to escape. And that kind of stuff does change your life in a way, because it's more than money. It's more than physical possessions. It's the fact that you're sitting there sometimes and you think, like I have in my, how houses, at least here in the States, have sitting rooms. We don't know why. It's an extra living room. Nobody uses it. It's just freaking room in the house. They build them like that for some reason. And that's where I have a bookcases that have all my foreign copies. And because they'll send you your author copies. And sometimes when I go and look at that, I'm kind of blown away by seeing all these books in all these different languages. And then just kind of knowing that, oh my God, like someone's reading this in Slavic, in Italian, and German, and French, and Portuguese. It's insane. I feel like that's where the changes kind of come, is from that. But other than that, I feel like there really isn't. I mean, yes, sometimes you do get recognized. It's always, I feel like, a shock when you're in your normal life and someone's like, oh my God, but I also have a bizarre last name. So it's like, it's a noticeable last name, but it's not like you're a celebrity where, people be at the grocery store, like,
you're not getting papped coming out of the grocery store.
Cool. I want to thank you both for joining us for this. This has been incredible. The folks in the comments have been really enjoying it. I really appreciate taking time out of this. Jennifer, what is your latest book? I believe I've got a sort of a picture of it here.
It's Born of Blood and Ash. It just came out in August, yes. And that is the final book in the prequel series to the Blood and Ash series. So if you haven't read it, you can read all of them before the next book in the the Blood and Ash world comes out. So
Okay, and if people are new to your work, where should they start?
it depends on what you like. If you're into fantasy, I would suggest starting with either A Shadow in the Ember or From Blood and Ash. If you're into contemporary, I have quite a bit of many of those. Wait for You was my first ever indie published book. Was Wait for You. So there's that you could read. But it really depends on what you like. I pretty much write everything except for historical and inspiration.
Great. All right. You can head to Jennifer's website. We have a link to that below, and check out her catalogue. It's amazing stuff. I'm going to start, I think, on... I've downloaded one of the books onto audiobook that I'm going to start this weekend, I think.
The Blood and Ash audio is very good. Very good.
The graphic audio has just released on them. If you haven't,
that's exciting. That's like the movie for your mind.
Yeah. What is graphic audio? This is new to me.
Graphic audio is has been like blowing up lately, where it's a full cast audio and there's sound effects and music as well. So it really is like listening to a movie.
It's like a movie with just no visuals. I mean, it's they do such an amazing job.
Yeah, it's a more multi-sensory audiobook experience. Audiobook diehards like myself don't necessarily gravitate to it because it's a little slower in terms of how you listen. Yeah.
And it's not the exact 100% the book. They do
exactly
edit some things out. Nothing ever major, but if you are kind of a diehard for that, you may notice teeny tiny like discrepancies in chapters and things like that. Nothing that changes the story, but just kind of minor things they do leave out.
They're really fun, and they're great for people who are newer to audio. I'm always trying to convert people to the Church of Audiobooks because I love them so much. So a graphic audio and like a nice 1,000-piece puzzle with a hot cup of tea, that could be like a very nice evening for yourself. That's elite.
Well, that's your autumn weekend recommendation from Rebecca Heyman, who of course is an editor here on Reedsy. If you're looking for someone to feedback on manuscript you're working on, I believe you're open to limited requests this autumn, perhaps. I saw on your Insta.
Oh no, Reedsy doesn't let me run specials, so I have certain offerings that are not.
So do not whatever you do not go to her Instagram. Don't
definitely look at my Instagram at all, for sure. Definitely not. But you could reach out to me on Reedsy anytime.
Great. All right, Jennifer, I hope we get to speak again. It's been absolutely fantastic. We'll be in touch soon.
And I just want to say really quickly, for any of your viewers who may be in the path of the Hurricane Milton, I just want to say I hope you guys are being safe and it goes past with as least amount of damage possible.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, everyone.
Absolutely. Our Floridians, keep yourselves safe.
Stay safe down there. Yeah. All right. Thank you both for joining. We're going to have another webinar next week talking about influencer and viral marketing, strangely enough. So I hope you tune in for that one. I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, guys.